Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my final verdict on the Sony FE 85mm f1.8. And this is a very popular lens, obviously, for a lot of shooters because many consider this to be Sony's best value lens. Best combination of, value combined with optical performance combined with build. And I'm certainly not here to disavow anyone of that notion, because after spending time with the lens and putting it up against 5 other competing autofocus lenses, I have come to the conclusion that it does still continue to represent a very strong value. However, there are some other considerations to look at when we wrap things up, looking at this lens several years after its initial release with some new competitors that have come to market. Now, when this lens first came to market, of course, it was only competing really on the autofocus 85mm front with the Zeiss Batis 85mm f1.8, and then the G Master came along. But initially it had a fairly shallow pool to swim in, and that has changed. Now, if you're interested in looking, kind of following along on how it compares to other lenses more directly, you can find that as a part of my playlist that has the shootout between all of these lenses, including the Viltrox 85mm f1.8 and the Batis f1.8 lenses, along with the Samyang Sigma and Sony G Master f1.4 lenses. So first of all, let's take a look at the build and the general features of the lens. As you can see, it is a reasonably compact lens, and compared to the competition, it is definitely light and compact, and it easily bests all of them when it comes to the diminutive size and dimensions of the lens. And but it does it without a whole lot of compromises. It's got a very sturdy feeling body that feels like a lightweight metal alloy, probably something like an aluminum alloy. It is supposed to have weather sealing. It is kind of hard to feel the weather gasket back here, and so it's certainly not a robust gasket, but according to the information, kind of like the Sony Zeiss 55mm f1.8 sonar, I reviewed that lens and I walked away saying that it wasn't weather sealed because I couldn't see any evidence of it, but the literature says that it is, and so I'm gonna have to take their word on this. There's not necessarily an external evidence of that, but anyway, they do say that it does have a sealed body. Beyond that, it comes with lens hood. It comes in a really common 67mm front filter thread, and there's really nothing to complain about in terms of the build. It does have a few things that some competitors don't have, namely it does have on and off, or should I say AF/MF switch on the barrel that allows you to turn autofocus on and off. Note, however, that even in manual focus mode, you'll note that there is no hard stop anywhere. This is a focus by wire, which means that any input here, the camera, it has to be connected to a camera, the camera has to be powered on, and then in the appropriate mode here, and then your input is going to be routed through the focus motor, which moves the elements. Now, Sony helps to compensate for that by a couple of things. First of all, you will get typically a magnified image at the active spot or focus point. It will magnify on your LCD or in the viewfinder, so that helps to visually confirm focus. Beyond that, of course, there is also a electronic distance gauge that shows up, and so that helps you also to know, make sure you're moving in the correct direction. This doesn't have a distance window on the barrel. Basically, none of these lenses do outside of those that have an electronic, because there's no coupling there. There's nothing physically to show in a window, and so there's some lenses like the Batis that compensate by giving you a OLED screen that will actually display information and focus like a window, distance window. But in this case, you've got enough focus aids that you can manually focus just fine. The damping is pretty decent. It's not quite as refined maybe as the G Master, but it focuses quite well and fairly consistently. I didn't find manual focus to be all that difficult. I will note that if you need to make a major focus change, you're probably gonna have to make about 3 full rotations like this, because change does not come quickly with that. And so the other thing that you're going to see here is that it does have the focus hold button, which can be programmed to a variety of different functions. I used to always program this for IAF because it provided a convenient way to activate IAF. Now, well, at least with my A7 series bodies, you know, IAF is now full-time after firmware updates. And so that certainly helps that, you know, I can map that to something else. However, if I was shooting with this on, say, my A6500, which you certainly can do because it's small and light enough to be a decent match for APS-C, those bodies have not yet adapted that outside of the A6400. And so that, you know, that might still be a practical application, but there's a number of things you can program there. So I would certainly rather have the button than not have it. Now, when it comes to the autofocus performance, I used it in a variety of different settings. And in many ways, this lens came out as the most consistently great performing of the bunch when it came to either tracking action or tracking eyes in IAF. And by the way, you know, I have tested these on both human and animal subjects. I find that Sony's pet IAF is useful. Just the one thing to watch out for that is that you need to make sure to turn it off after you're done, because it really will throw focus off with a human subject after the fact. And so anyway, just watch out for that. But anyway, it performed really, really well. It actually came out with very so slightly the highest score in my action comparison. While it didn't have as many perfectly focused results as either the G Master or the Samyang f1.4 lenses, it had by far the most well-focused results between perfectly focused and then just ever so slightly off, but still acceptable. What I gave as 5s and 4s, and then it only had 2 that were, you know, kind of focused, but none that were completely missed focus in that burst, you know, of a full-on sprint, the subject running towards the camera. And so it came out with a really good score there. I had no issues at all with IAF. It just nailed the eye every time in my portrait series. And then let's take a look at how it performs for video AF.
Sony 85mm F1.8.
As you can see, it really does a good job. It's confident, it's very quiet in operation, it's very fast, and so in doing the major focus pulls, it is noticeably a little bit stronger in terms of the torque than any of the f1.4 lenses. And outside of just a little bit of settling on the subject, you know, sometimes just that final little micro adjustment, I didn't see any kind of pulsing or misses in that, and so it got really strong marks. The only one that I thought might have been just a hair better was the Batis lens, which is also very smooth and just slightly more refined. But when it comes to everyday autofocus, I had really good results with this. I was able to, you know, track some action just in like event type settings, and was really satisfied with the autofocus performance. Now, when it comes to the image quality, and here's a segment where it breaks down that, actually there's a couple that look at different things. You know, there's not a whole lot to complain about there either. It is not the absolute strongest performer of the bunch in the corners. The center is fairly close, maybe at f1.8, maybe a little bit less contrast than some of the top performers, like either the Sigma or the G Master lens, and maybe to a little lesser extent the Samyang. But then when you stop it down a little bit, it sharpens right up. But don't get me wrong, it's very sharp from f1.8 on. It's just got really good competition that I put it up against. It does show very minor amounts of longitudinal chromatic aberration in certain situations, but not enough to be concerned about in any way. It will show some deformation, geometric deformation along the edges of the frame in the form of what's commonly called cat eye or lemon-shaped bokeh highlights, and you'll see that along the edges of the frame. You stop it down some and it improves, but it's certainly not the top performer. It's near the bottom of the heap when it comes to that. And so in a few ways, the bokeh quality is just very subtly not quite as refined as the best performers. Probably the best performer of the bunch was the Samyang in this. But again, it's very close to splitting hairs. There is only minor differences to separate them, and that's when you're putting them side by side. At the end of the day, it provides a strong enough case that one questions where the Batis lens differentiates itself very much. The one thing that the Batis has that neither this lens, and for that matter any of the others have, is that it does come with an optical image stabilization. However, for many of us, most modern Sony bodies do come with image stabilization, and so in-body image stabilization that's quite effective. And so, in practical everyday use on, for example, either my A7R Mark III or my A6500, I didn't actually see a big difference between those that the one that had OSS and the ones that just relied on steady shot. That being said, not every Sony body, of course, has optical image stabilization. Or steady shot inside. So if you're one that's shooting with a body that doesn't have that, the Batis might still be a tempting option, over the Sony for that reason. In terms of their optical performance, there wasn't a huge amount of difference between the two. And, there's a little give here and there. The Batis, as it's pretty typical for Zeiss lenses, maybe had a tiny bit more micro contrast and a little bit better color, but again, not by a big margin. Now, the spoilers here that you might want to consider are either on the bottom end, the Viltrox 85mm F1.8 STM, which in terms of optical performance and bokeh performance was just as good, if not a hair better. Where it might fall a little bit behind is when it comes to autofocus, which is a bit less refined than what this lens is. However, Viltrox has already rolled out 2 firmware updates that have made major improvements. So it's not all that far behind. So if you're on a really tight budget, you can get the Viltrox for under $400, whereas this lens might cost you, closer to the $600 US range. Then at $100 more expensive is the Samyang AF f1.4, which is a really, really good lens, and it's already on its 3rd firmware revision, version 4.0, and they've helped to refine the autofocus, so it really performs really well there now. And it was actually the one that was I gave it an 89% score compared to a 90% score for this. And of course, it offers the more nuanced performance, better bokeh of an f1.4 lens. And so that's maybe the spoiler in the bunch, because it's not radically more expensive than this lens. At the end of the day, it's up to you. I mean, a lot of people will feel more comfortable with a Sony branded lens because maybe it's going to provide the most consistent performance. It's always a risk-reward type situation, and it's entirely up to you. But these days, this is still a fantastic lens. But there are also some very good competitors. I guess the choice is up to you. We'll see who the cat chooses. I'm Dustin Abbott. If you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review. A lot of sample photos there, a lot of information that I've culled from my comparison series. There's also buying links there if you'd like to purchase one for yourself. Beyond that, there are the typical links where you can follow me on social media, sign up to become a patron, or for my newsletter. And if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.